All right, welcome to the Bridge Podcast. This is episode number 47. Today, my guest is Professor Shlomo Dubnov, and Shlomo teaches at the University of California, San Diego, where he directs the Center for Research in Entertainment and Learning at their Qualcomm Institute. So this puts him at the intersection of composition, music, aesthetics, philosophy, computer science, and a number of topics, which is right where I want to be personally and where I'm very interested. So this is a great conversation, and let's just get into it. Could you start us off by just telling us about your coffee habits a little bit to give us a sense of your personality?
Well, which is something we discussed that I'm not strong in coffee, so but keeping with the tradition, I understand a lot of podcast. Well, mostly drink coffee, right? I mean, need it. So consuming, not always with moderation. I would say my two choices would be actually anything which is really fine grind, which could be Turkish or espresso. So recently I was kind of trying to investigate whether I can use Turkish coffee for espresso because I couldn't find espresso or the other way around. So since kind of we travel a lot and actually, Europe, France, Italy, and then Israel and, the Middle East, you get these two flavors of fine grind coffee, which is very strong. And I think that gives you some idea about my coffee habits. It's having it strong.
Gotcha. Strong in a lot of it, a lot of volume of it.
Yeah. Unfortunately. I mean, it can be small shots, but still.
The previous episode was with a Turkish microtonal guitarist, and so it's funny to have the preferences be both very aligned. But anyway, it's good to get a sort of window into who you are through your relationship with my favorite beverage. But a lot of what I want to talk to you about today is sort of algorithmic composition, computational creativity, and that type of thing. So to start off with algorithmic composition, I have a sort of provocation, and that is the question of whether or not all composition is in some respects algorithmic. Is it, when we say algorithmic composition, is it more about the composer's awareness of the sort of like instructions that they're implementing, or I mean, is it just not useful to consider all composition algorithmic?
Well, I think it's almost like asking whether, what we speak now, language, is it algorithmic, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there is an algorithm somewhere, depending how you define algorithm. And I would say that, probably in the notion of being very formal in the composition. Yes, I mean, people, some are more intuitive, some are more formal. But even in improvisation, I think there is an algorithmic aspect. It's just entrained. It's maybe not formal algorithmic in the way, of the structuralist theories of composition that you design everything on paper and then you basically fill in the dots because you have a rule.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the name itself is super interesting because algorithm is basically just a prescription. Like, well, it's like making Turkish coffee.
Mm-hmm.
You have to know how many cups you put and whether you boil it with or take it out. But I mean that that doesn't mean that you always have to stick to the same formal way of thinking, especially if we think about music, something that has an emotional aspect and has imagination, that we kind of don't tend to think that imagination is an algorithm because we imagine things that we don't have recipes for, right? Otherwise, what we need the imagination for, everything is planned for us, right? So in that sense, I think there is a slightly different concept which kind of relates to whether it's algorithmic or machine learning. And maybe I don't want to have a very long answer, maybe follow-up question, but if you include in algorithmic stuff which you're in some sense entrained to do, which means you have a sense of prediction, you have a sense of what is expected, what is not expected, and you have some sort of a little man in your brain, I don't know, that kind of pulling you towards Bayesian brain theories and stuff like that. But if you have some kind of a little something in the brain that takes the evidence and has its own ways of computing it, formal or less formal, all, but it is an algorithm. So in some sense, I didn't answer the question about composition in the sense of whether all composition is, because I almost threw at you a much harder question, whether our consciousness is algorithmic, right? But yeah.
I mean, it was meant as a provocation, I think. But I mean, I very
Yeah.
much think that we are, just physical algorithms in meat suits. So, and I'm very on board with
You're very reductionist, or
yeah.
yes.
I mean, the record label I'm trying to make is called Physicalist Sound. So, you know,
Mm-hmm.
but so I mean, you mentioned mechanical processes in like the music of Xenakis and Brian Eno and Steve Reich. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and
That
so
was
I'm
in our kind of exchange before, right? So
right, yeah,
those
yeah.
are not, yeah.
Can
So,
you elaborate on those and how you see those fitting into this?
well, I mean, I think when we talk about algorithmic composition today, when we teach, I teach a class on algorithmic composition or compositional algorithms, and there is a little semantic difference here. But we tend to think about algorithms as some kind of just lines of code, if you want, or if you take a little cynical view at what was the old AI, even if it's supposed to represent you know something the human would do, right? These were long. This is kind of computer scientists trying to be cynical about previous computer scientists,
Mhm.
saying like AI used to be long programs in Lisp, right? So you write a lot of code, okay, and it executes something, right? Now, whether you do this with formal grammars, L systems, you do this with genetic algorithms, but eventually you write some kind of a mechanical system, right? That now starts spurring off something that could be eventually rendered into sound, right?
Mhm.
Uh, so, and this is kind of the old school algorithm composition, which kind of bothered me when, even though, as I said, I do cover this in classes, but it bothered me because it was kind of giving you two options: whether you go with abstract ideas, abstract music, which you know, I and I don't want to be like perceived as if I'm a little critical. I mean, I was trained as a modern composer,
Mhm.
so, and I find a lot of modern music, very abstract music, super interesting.
Mhm.
It may be not the most communicative music to a lot of people, but once you get used to thinking about sound that kind of emerges and doesn't have tonal structure, doesn't have rhythm, doesn't have melody, but has something else going on, you actually are engaged in. It's almost like looking at abstract paintings. You actually have to, if you don't pay attention, if you don't invest into trying to analyze what you hear, you miss. But um, but still, I mean, that was kind of limited to very particular type of approaches to music, right? Yeah, 12-tone music, abstract music, aleatoric music, John Cage, and of course Xenakis with his formalist music was kind of put it on the table as like here is a way you can take
Mhm.
physical equations, you can run the processes, and you generate music, and it had its his the value was there because he always intentionally uh, was trying to create music that was not you know I don't know if that's a true reaction to Romanticism or World
Mhm.
War II. Milan Kundera wrote about music of Xenakis that he loves it because actually, the over romantic music was kind of connotated with horrors of the Second World War.
Right.
But now you stand in front of massive sound and you admire it like you would admire, thunder, right? Nature, it's a power of nature, which is great. But that's a very specific one. But then, if you think about people who can try to use processes in a less abstract way. And of course, Steve Reich has a lot of like the phase kind of his phase music, pendulum music, um, and, and Brian Eno, he has his algorithmic compositions, right? Music for airports. and now you have actually kind of chords, and you have ambient music that is infinitely going, which is also super interesting. So I
Mm-hmm.
think now you can see that algorithms can create large variety of musical styles, but in some sense they're always, how to say, there is stationary aspect. If you think about like statistics,
Mm-hmm.
stationarity in statistics, you launch something, it keeps generating. Okay, it keeps generating textures. These textures could be total. These textures could be very abstract. We could have look at these metronomes. You can see all kinds of synchronizations going in and out of sync. It's super exciting, but then the question is, where is the human suddenly intent?
Mm-hmm.
Because you let go of the music process, and then you have this other algorithmic composition aspect where you actually write algorithms to imitate music which was written according to maybe more traditional manual ways.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you look at David Cope and in his style imitation, but these now become expert systems, and these expert systems require a lot of coding.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was this dilemma for me that unless you want to go with this texture, regardless of whether it's abstract or more tonal, ambient or Sinakis like. But if you want to build something that has structures, phases, it has A, B, A, whatever, A,
Mm-hmm.
B, C, maybe theme and then counter theme and bridges and variations. Uh, this was, you had to write a lot of rules for that.
Mm-hmm.
And as a computer scientist, there's always this kind of a question or paradox, kind of an Occam razor. I mean, is the algorithm the most efficient way to do it? I mean, do you spend more ink on writing the code than you would spend on writing the actual music, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there is something conceptually very strange about writing code that, let's say, composes in the style of Prokofiev. If you have to encode huge amounts of data and write very long programs that eventually, it's true that you can keep generating more and more examples, but usually it's done like as an experiment, and you write a huge chunk of code to generate a prelude, and then you move to another composer. So, and you could have written this prelude yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why go through an algorithm? So I think this is where my interest in machine learning and AI came in, because you can actually have today machines that find their own algorithms based on examples, and it kind of allows you actually to do a lot of generative kind of music, but it's not just a texture, okay? And it has a variety of styles, and you could even do this, what they call them zero shot, which means like it's true that most of the stuff done today with all these neural networks has huge amount of data to train,
Mm-hmm.
but I mean, I'm mostly interested in systems that you can go on stage and you play into a computer and he finds like a small model of your own style, and you can improvise with that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an algorithm, but you don't write the algorithm. You write the system that now is able to find an algorithm to generate, and this now becomes a tool that you can start, conversation. You can start creating conversation with. You can play with it. You can react to it. So I think it was such a long answer that I forgot the question. So what was the question?
Um, well, I guess I'm curious. I feel like you're hinting at something along the lines of like Kolmogorov complexity or something like that. Do you feel like the how parsimonious a system is affects how it resonates for you aesthetically? Like, do you want to know that there's a certain like ecology to the information processing? Does that like land more for
Mhm.
you as a listener?
Well, yeah, I mean that's actually it fits excellently into what I was thinking. Maybe it wasn't evident, because as I said, listening to music has to be an active process. Okay, and I mentioned this in the context of abstract music that we are not maybe so naturally processing that we are not aware of, but it all has to do with some way of us encoding, decoding information, right? So if an algorithm, and Kolmogorov complexity would be basically counting, the lines of code that would generate that music, right? But it's also a good way to think about how complex the music is, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And whether you can write an algorithm that can now keep generating music from relatively short amount of code, right? Because if the code is super long, then maybe we're missing something.
Mm-hmm.
So, Kolmogorov complexity or Shannon complexity, which is more statistical,
Mm.
they're very, very basic tools in the way I think about music, because you can think about questions of perception, questions of anticipation, the fact that when we listen to music, we do form some sort of an explanation in our head. That little man in the head is actually working hard in time to predict the next note. Or when we talk, right? Even though we're not, we can try to demonstrate. Like I can say something and stop in the middle, and you will
Finish your sentence.
finish, continue, guess, whatever. But there are only few options, right? Right.
Mm-hmm.
So in some sense, while I'm talking, you're completing what I'm going to think, and that creates your own thoughts, and that's your own imagination. So the same way, I think in music, you play something, but you already hear somehow a variety of options of
Mm-hmm.
where music goes, and this creates, basically, this idea of implication realization, Moore's theories, or validation violation of expectation as a compositional tool. So whether you do this by learning, I rather think about Shannon complexity rather than Kolmogorov complexity, just because it's very hard to find the program that does that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's maybe more easier to build a statistical model than an actual, fixed algorithm.
Mm-hmm.
But since we're using algorithms, we're using sometimes compression algorithms that come from other domains, which are algorithms which are really Kolmogorovian in the sense that they actually perform a fixed sequence of operations to create some kind of code book that predicts the next that you can then generate with. So we kind of use Kolmogorov complexity as a tool to generate, or basically extract structure from data,
Mm-hmm.
and then generate more data. And I think in that sense, yes, you're exactly to the point that being able to reason something out means that you have a simple explanation, and how you measure the simplicity could be Kolmogorovian. Yeah.
By the way, I want to also commend you on being the first person to say Bayesian before me in this one of these podcasts. It took 46 or something episodes for somebody else to say it first, but
Well, and this is about music, right?
yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, I guess the idea of the brain being like an inference engine is something that appeals to me, and the way that you're using computers to sort of do more of like an assisted thing, where it's giving a prediction or sharing its prediction of what you're going to play, and then that allows the musician to adjust what they're playing. That seems kind of in line with that. Would you say?
Well, so I think it's somewhere in your question there is an aspect of what is the actual musical use or application, right? So you can think about this as a computer aided composition, or you can think about this as an improvisation system. Uh, and just because of the nature of music making, they might be slightly different. But I think, and then there is totally different application, which could be evaluating, the aesthetics of the piece or trying to infer some aspects. Of course, there is this field of music information retrieval where you want to label music, find it according to genres. I'm a little less interested in that, but kind of the musicological aspect of being able to analyze musical structure and predict where surprise happens, where there are some changes, even just segmenting, finding sections, and being able to eventually maybe use it for something else, either to generate or to analyze or explain our perception of music. All of these methods, I think, do have a very strong mathematical kind of aspect of this kind of Bayesian, if you want, because you assume that there is some kind of a generative process, and that generative process, we don't really, I don't want to say care about the details, because the details matter, of course, right? And eventually, you write the composition, every detail matters. But when we perceive it, we are not we're not tapes, we're not recording machines, right?
Mm-hmm.
We actually don't exactly hear every little detail. We have some kind of an abstract representation that happens in our brain, and you can call it inference, because we do kind of find simplified representations internally, and then we use them to predict the next step. So I think that this whole process of learning music, understanding music, and generating music has to go through these steps of inference, and then maybe moving on to the second step. So um, once we're okay with this idea that there is the musical surface, and this is not any new idea, Schenker's analysis of music with the foreground and background, and Ursatz and whatever, the deeper structure. Mm-hmm. He actually pointed to the idea that, if we analyze music, and it's true that his is kind of geared towards tonal music, but still, there's kind of level of structure, same as in language. Right? We have the grand idea. This idea maybe is broken into substructures. So if you have word phrase and noun phrase or something like this, so in music we don't have exactly the same equivalence, but we still have some kind of layers of structure that eventually realize themselves in the actual notes or sounds that we produce. Mm-hmm. But these kind of structures behind, in the background, right? These are kind of the latent representations. And then the question is, so how do you use them? Okay. So you can think about using them as a sketchpad, right? And this is what kind of a music meta creation talks about, that you don't care about the actual, it's composing about, you compose the composition, mm-hmm. right? Or you create the creation, like any kind of meta approach. But in that case, or in any case, whether you do this offline or you do this in real time, you still think about this whole process of inferring some level of structure, and then going back from that structure and filling this in, and actually creating the next segment, the next 16 bars of music. Mm-hmm. But again, I sort of find myself losing track of the original question.
No, that's great. I'm curious to see where your mind goes with it. With the meta creation thing, so I guess I'm curious, is that, like, I feel like a lot of people, when they do the creative process, they're blending the rendering process and the creative process. So it's like they're kind of like rendering as they go and figuring out as they go along. But then, like, if you're creating the creation, maybe it's more of a structurally oriented thing that then you can fill in the blanks according to whatever process of rendering you want. Is that on track at all?
I think very much. It even goes into more basic questions of what it means to be creative, right? Like So you can say that meta creation is you know, maybe the next step after deep fake.
Gotcha.
I mean, you have some generative process that, you know, can create images and create sounds. So of course, a lot of this is the actual algorithms that are able now to generate music from examples. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe going back to you know, Xenakis or Eno, or maybe they were, I would say, fixed algorithms, because they created a lot of variations, but kind of the genre was set by the
Mm-hmm.
algorithm. Now you can actually have much more flexibility, and you don't have to write the code. It be learned by the machine. But um, you know, with all this advancement, it still thinks about music as a texture. Okay, so even if you simulate, unless you're able to provide some scenarios, some constraint, if you don't have a way to control your generator, it might generate something that now looks very structured. Maybe it has a chord progression, has rhythm, and has melodies. They're still textures.
Mm-hmm.
They're just much more complex textures. Okay. Uh, Same way as you know, you train GANs or whatever the neural networks on faces.
Mm-hmm.
You would say, well, now it generates another celebrity face. Uh, okay, it's not texture, right? It had so much structure that it learned, but in some sense, it's texture. It's just a statistical
Gotcha.
rendering.
Yeah.
You take noise, you're able now to create structure from noise in much more detailed way. But then again, we still, even though we moved a step, we are, you know, on the elevator of going from something totally mechanistic to you know, it goes back to the question: Are we just algorithms in Flash? Right?
Mm-hmm.
But if we do still kind of allow that uh, ambiguity of the mind-body problem, you think that there is something that we have an intent, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we moved up on this whatever rocket or elevators to the sky of um, uh, of spirit. uh, so it's not totally mechanistic, but it's still a mechanism. Okay, it's still texture. It's still a device that maybe can generate a lot of variations, but it doesn't have an intent. And I think we'll keep getting this feeling that we don't have the intent. The more we understand about ourselves, the brain, the signals, right, the
Mm-hmm.
more the machines become intelligent and creative. It will push our self dignity and some sort of consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
or the ability of intent further. You'll have to prove yourself on a higher level, but still, meta creation is still kind of assuming that now you want to specify the creative parameters. So, how do you delegate to the machine a lot of the processes of musical knowledge and musical skills, which before that would require you, you know, years and years of training,
Mm-hmm.
and now the machine can do this for you, but then you're still trying to be in charge. Or maybe you will need to be able just to communicate with that machine, almost as with another musician. So you need just to create the language.
Mm-hmm.
But even that language is a meta creation, because, you know, if you and I improvise, uh, there is a meta creation communication between us, right? Because, you know, I don't specify to you every note that you're going to play, and, you know, I won't be able to guess every note you want me to play. But there is something creative going on, even in this conversation, right?
Mm-hmm. Totally.
There is some kind of a meta level going on. And I guess if you listen to this later, you'll find out that, you know, a lot of, you know, what I said was nonsense. But I hope some meta ideas were still true.
Mm-hmm. There's a like I feel like a common saying that people have, which is like that composition is spontaneous, or sorry, improvisation is spontaneous composition, and I feel like that's a little bit of just like a buzzword type saying, but it seems like improvisation is very like front and center to you. What about more like like the old days of computer music when it was more like you
Mm.
ran the code for a day and then it plopped out the final product and there was no sort of in the moment connection. Is there anything to
Mhm.
be said for that type of thing too, or like in your mind is it just far too fruitful to have the sort of feedback of in the moment co-creativity?
Well, I think we're still in the process of trying to get to this co-creativity. I wish the improvisation was mutual in the sense that controlling the machine is possible. So we want to, we want to be able to drive these algorithms, guide them, and can be responsive in one way or another. But unfortunately, too often it's the human who is interested in the machine, and the machine is not interested in the human. And um, you know, it's funny because we might fear that we actually maybe almost prevent the machine from finding its own interest in us, because then we're really in the point that you have to convince the computer that you're a worthwhile human being to be related to. uh, and so I think this level of autonomy. I mean, we have more and more autonomous computing today, right? And if you want to think about generative music systems, you delegate to them some creativity. So there is an aspect of autonomy there, but you still want to have, I'm not speaking about Asimov's rules of robotics because it's not going to hurt you, right?
Right.
Music, I mean, so I think there's something much more deeper that we're still afraid to let um, let our sense of control and some sort of superiority, if I want to say,
Definitely, yeah.
over the machine. Okay, so and I think this is actually a very interesting point because you know I mean, well, now in an international project about human machine co-creativity. Uh, and I think one of the aspects that somehow comes through experience and working, and also looking at musicians work with our algorithms today, um, that you can see, and of course it could be both ways. I mean, some people could be super excited and be inspired by new ideas that the computer generates, and they take them further.
Mm-hmm.
Some people might be super annoyed with that. um, but it's always the human reaction that matters, and
Mm-hmm.
not the machine's reaction. And then you feed something to the machine in the next phase, and it will generate something else. You can specify some scenarios or meta control. So if you agree that you're going to improvise on some standard, the machine will please try to follow the same structure of chords. Then maybe you have some controls that you either manually control, or maybe the machine can extract some parameters and kind of be adaptive. But but really, what I feel is lacking is that the human is not trying to impress the machine, so it doesn't demand him so much. Right?
Okay.
I mean, it's still maybe an instrument uh, of a higher level.
Mm-hmm.
So, even an improvisation agent, there is always this question whether it's a musical instrument or it's an agent or a compositional
Mm-hmm.
tool, right? Because we think about instruments as being something of where we have almost total control, and then as we go further, you give up some level of control to the machine itself, and these generative algorithms are not exactly instruments, but they're still, I mean, they're texture generators of musical structure.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but still, I mean, the machine doesn't have an intent, right? We still want to control the machine. We want it to be more adaptive, more responsive, and we're fine with letting go to some extent. But we are the musicians, And as any situation where you have somebody very dominating, you know, you miss on something.
Mm-hmm.
You miss something on trying to understand the others. You know, it will not really create a discourse. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if I don't really um, try to impress you or the audience or whatever, right? Um, and I'm just like, and maybe I'm doing this, just with my own train of thought. Then, in some sense, yeah, I mean, whatever I have to do, I will do, and I'll walk away, and maybe I'll feel that, oh yeah, it was nice. He asked me the questions I wanted, but no, it will not demand me. I mean, I will not be. The novelty will be limited. It will not push me towards something else, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Because I will not discover something from that other agent, that other person, that would make me change. And
Interesting.
um, and I think that this is like a philosophical question, really. I mean, um, do we really want to be in a situation where we have agent musicians that can judge you and they can be bored with you and they will refuse to play with you because you're not to their standard?
Right. It's funny. I get the sense that there's a concern among people about like a potential loss of authorship, and like just people are concerned about kind of like these conventional narratives about like AI taking over, um,
Mhm.
and like I don't get the sense that there's anything to be concerned about. But I mean, are you concerned about losing your authorship as a composer because too much of it is being done by a
Mhm.
machine? Like I feel like that's a kind of uh,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
philosophical thing to dissolve.
Well, it's interesting, and early on when people were kind of considering algorithmic composition, if you kind of want to go and relate this to the beginning of our conversation, people say, "Well, yeah, I mean, I didn't write that, I didn't write, the music, but I wrote the algorithm, so I can own the algorithm, right? So you can have always you can have authorship, right? But I mean, I think we're beyond that question of assigning rights.
Hmm.
Um, and not because it's not important. I mean, I think assigning rights also has to do a lot with the musical, whatever the ecosystem of. Well, basically, the composer has to make a living, so he wants to produce something that has a value. So I'm not saying put an NFT on every computer generated
Yeah.
sequence, but there is that aspect that I'm not going into, right? Because in loss of authorship might maybe translate to loss of income.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so maybe there are other models. Business models of music are actually, I think, very much part of also music making in some weird way. But we have to be aware of that, because
Mm-hmm.
if there is no way for you to, in this case, I'm kind of ivory tower is really luxury. Sorry, I know that I have the privilege of, no, I earn my living from teaching and whatever, and
Mm-hmm.
research, right? But it's a very very protected environment, frankly. But if you're a composer or any kind of a creator or a practitioner of field where you're not living on taxpayers' money,
Mm-hmm.
sorry,
Right.
let's be sincere, or you don't have huge endowment, somebody else got in a private university, and you have to sell every product that you do. Uh, this becomes an issue, right, in authorship. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
um, but I'm I do believe that there will be ways to monetize on what you do regardless of authorship problem.
Mm-hmm.
So having said that, let's go back to maybe other aspect of authorship, and that's kind of the authenticity of that piece,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a different question. um, because if this is something that has no father, nobody kind of taking responsibility, or maybe it's done in mechanized ways, and if you don't assign um, entity, right? Um, or sort of like, you know, if you don't want to think about your computer as a living organism
Mm-hmm.
that can claim authorship, right? Then basically it's just a mechanical piece of production, right? Uh, and so my only way to think about this is a little bit referring back to, you know, what Walter Benjamin said about um, mechanical reproduction, right? Well, now if you can reproduce music by, or reproduce art by, or photography or print or recording, right? What
Mm-hmm.
is the value of that piece? And now we're in a situation of, you know, art not in the age of reproduction, art in the age of computer generation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you now can generate a lot of art. So whether the aura, you know, that idea that a piece exists in a specific place and specific time, you have to basically put an effort to go and see it. And does that create more value to this work than something that you can basically, you know, maybe go down the store and buy a record, or now download this on your whatever
Mm-hmm.
iTunes or whatever Spotify streaming, or maybe you have an algorithm that keeps generating new music. Uh, does that mean that this music or this art is less valuable? Um, no, I don't think so. So I don't think you have to. The value of the piece of art is not really related to authorship.
Mm-hmm.
I think the authorship is more how the person engaging in art creation is compensated for his effort. Really. Of course, there is also an aspect of pride, right? But you know, okay, assigning credit is easy. Paying for it is much more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So, and so, in that sense, yeah, it's an interesting question. It's an important question because I think it also has to do with the whole musical business,
Mm-hmm.
which is altered by the way technology, you know, in some senses leading, modifying, changing, or I mean, it's really deeply involved in the process of music making from every step, from synthesizing sounds to recording to editing to delivery to recommendation systems, and now actually the composition part. Right? So,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it changes the way music is done, and it changes the way music is consumed. It changes the way you know, artists make their living, and how uh, people learn to appreciate art. Uh, and maybe it's ubiquitous. Maybe there is proliferation to a point of some saturation. I mean, these are all dangerous, and they're valid dangers, because I think much more concern for me is not the authenticity or the authorship of the specific piece and the composer. And I know that a lot of my composer colleagues will totally disagree with me
Mm-hmm.
because it's like I would say the authorship on also on a scientific paper doesn't matter, and it actually doesn't. I mean, it's important for career, for you know, people know, you know, that you're out there. You get more opportunities. You get funding from other research grants or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the quality of the research paper is not determined by the name on it.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
whether it does it. So the musical result also, you know, and in science it is pretty acknowledged that, you know, if you didn't come up with this idea, very likely somebody else will come up with a very similar idea, and the idea that matters. In music, we sort of think that, of course, every musician has his own voice, and you have to develop, and we teach this
Mm-hmm.
to the students, that you have to develop your own personal voice. But I mean, if you had some kind of a new artistic idea, the way new way of looking at the world, a new way of expressing what you feel, what you think other people, you know, how they behave, you know, this kind of latent, this kind of a deeper understanding of the world, how you express it in music. I guess if you don't come up with this, you know, frankly, it's true. Okay, Picasso, you know, invented cubism. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there were some examples before, and he kind of
Mhm.
formalized it. But if it wasn't him, I'm sure somebody else would have come with very similar ideas. And what matters is the cubism and not that Picasso invented it. So,
Right.
yeah, so I think that's kind of take on the question of authorship as is.
Gotcha.
I think we need to find ways um, to allow people to make art and make their living from art, because I think it is very important.
Totally.
And yeah.
There's a bunch that I want to sort of dig deeper into there, but I
Mhm.
also want to get to a few extra topics before we run out of time.
Sure.
I'm just curious in terms of the research front. Like, I'd like to hear a little bit about your research on the sounds of COVID, but also, are there any particularly fruitful areas of research that you'd like to see sort of taken on by, any sort of researcher in this domain?
Mhm. Well, I mean, the sounds of COVID. We did this work. We published it in what is the Springer Nature Computer Science. It was a need of that moment.
Mm-hmm.
It came actually as another take on a few previous works where we used very much similar techniques, where we try to analyze or um, categorize, I would say, music for emotions. Okay? Uh, and the idea was that, again, and there's still people working on this. I don't know, kind of. I think today the question of COVID, with all its variants, and I don't know how much of this is being monitored by voice, but at the time of the pandemic, when the peak of the pandemic, and there were people were desperate for finding ways of quick and cheap
Mm-hmm.
um, and diagnostics. So so definitely voice that is infected by COVID had some slightly slight variations on the timbre or the texture. Okay? But unlike, let's say, works that try to recognize speakers or recognize musical instruments, where you have sort of like an overall stable pattern of how the frequencies are spread, or the energies of the frequencies are spread, or there is some kind of spectral signature.
Mm-hmm.
There, the effects were much more subtle, and the effects were statistical. So what we actually tried to do was look at the dynamics of the scene. And as I said, as I mentioned, we did before much more modest work where we tried to see if emotional vocalizations or emotional performances on musical instruments, because you can play the same tone in an aggressive way and in a much more mellow or happy way.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Even if it's the same timbre, there's something about the little deviations, the little changes in between the frequencies and how they're related that that we thought could be an indicator. In very it's a little bit far-fetched to say that this is related to the concept of anticipations, but it's really finding some dynamics and structures.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, in music, actually, there is a tool that is pretty powerful, and also the visualization is very telling, and that's so-called self-similarity. If you take a musical piece and you analyze this with some features, okay, and
Mm-hmm.
then you try basically to see, of course, you need to have some kind of a matching of distance between features, right? But then, if you have this sequence of features and you basically compare every instance in the piece to all the other instances of the piece, you can create this self-similarity matrix, which will actually show you, if it's done correctly, uh, either repeating blocks, because if there's a bunch of similar sounds here and there, that will repeat.
Mm-hmm.
Also, if there are melodies, you can see these kind of lines that go in back and forth. And people were using this to analyze structures and analyze musical form. So we did this on a very micro level, okay? And one of the problems with these approaches is that your self-similarity structure really depends on how you measure the distances. And basically, you need somehow, if you think about this as a picture, you have to play with basically the brightness. Okay. So you basically, some things have to stick out and others have to go back. Because, I mean, you would say that, finding this, it's very noisy. So finding the structures in this image is very hard on this self-similarity matrix. Now, in physics, people use this and they call this recurrence block. Okay. But basically, it does look at, if you think about trajectories or chaotic signals, it actually tries to see when some kind of a trajectory repeats itself. It doesn't have to be in perfect ways or strange structures or stuff like that. You can see them in these plots. And then, and once you have this plot, you can actually extract statistics. So it's the statistics of the repetitions. It's not the statistics of the signal. You first go to the signal, you create the self-similarity, and then you extract statistics. And these were the features we classify. So I got into very technical discussion, but it was surprising that we kind of had the tool. And I was aware of, other people, and I have colleagues who are also working in this field, and some of them, there are companies and startups now that actually do all kinds of vocal diagnostics for medical purposes. Mm-hmm. And there was a big initiative of collecting these things. So there was the data. We had this tool. So it kind of started with, we want to help somehow. We think we have a new idea. We think we can actually get some kind of, dive deeper into the texture of the sounds, of the vocal sounds affected by copy. And I think this was, at least to me, a very interesting experience, kind of pointing to the fact that, as musicians, we are very sensitive to detail. Mm-hmm. Okay. And our conversation was a little bit going between, do we need these abstract representations or do we care about the detail? But yeah, we are sensitive to detail. Mm-hmm. While in many other applications, like, speaker recognition or like temper recognition, you want to have these rough categories, but you don't really look at the small deviations and the small noises. And we had some of these tools because we're interested in music. And we actually plugged in the voice into the same algorithm that we use to analyze music, and eventually for generative purposes, for improvisation. Of course, we did this on a much smaller scale. And with this model, we were able to detect repetitions. And with these repetitions, we actually tried to characterize and then train a classifier, whether it's copied or not. But I think our contribution was not in the classifier, but in the fact that our features were really trying to find tiny motifs in the voice of code. Yeah.
That's very funny.
So, yeah. All right. Well, yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
No. I guess before we run out of time, are there any open questions in your field that you would like to see addressed, unrelated to COVID?
Well, no. First of all, I hope. And it's amazing how the world changes from one disaster to another. So I hope other disasters that go on now will settle down. And I don't have any solutions to them. Mm-hmm. And I hope people will be playing more music and maybe finding some common ground between. That's amazing, because if you look at a lot of conflicts and when you look at the music of people involved in these conflicts, and the music is very much common. Why do you fight? If you play the same music, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe, but then maybe they're sensitive to very little differences for us, and they're willing to go horrible about this. So I think the only thing to address is really maybe people should focus more on music and the fact that you have to perform with many other people in some coherence,
Mm-hmm.
and invest the energy there rather than in other forms of human activity. But we didn't have much, didn't have much time to kind of pick on your brains and see what you're interested in. So maybe you would like to have a kind of a closing statement
Well,
about the state of algorithmic composition or how you perceive it. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if I have any closing statement to give, but I'd love to have you back sometime to talk more about consciousness and sort of like the ideas that the brain is a musical instrument rather than a digital computer, that type of stuff, or just digging more into like stylometry and that type of style transfer work that you've done. But yeah, very interesting stuff, and yeah, I mean,
Well,
we'll have
mhm.
to talk more about algorithmic composition because I'm getting to this point now where like I generated like basically like an album, and then the next day I generated another one that was better with less effort, and I feel like that's interesting, and that opens up a lot of doors, and a lot of people have an aversion to that because they're so interested in having the authorship, but at the same time it's like, shouldn't we be creating more art that's better and like looking at on the meta level and trying to do the meta creation type thing that you're talking about? So I don't know. That's, I guess, where my
so
mind
so
is.
so so the I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right, but it's the eliminativist, right? That's how you pronounce it, right?
Yeah, as in
Project is the, yeah.
it's like a referencing the Daniel Dennett sort of school of
Mm-hmm.
thought for consciousness. I'm not sure if you have any credences in terms of theory of mind that you want to mention real quick, but
No,
um,
besides the Bayesian brain,
mhm.
I think that I will keep all. You know, maybe we'll keep it for the next session.
That sounds good.
The theory of mind.
Um, yeah,
All
I can
right.
share with you the spreadsheets that have gone into my process, though, because they're relatively dumb compared to the intelligent machines that you seem to be operating with. But
But
anyway,
I'm trying to make very dumb machines. I mean, really. I mean, I think the fact that they're dumb and they're doing great things that at least look great to us. I think this is a very interesting question about the philosophy of mind.
hmm
Right? I mean, maybe they're huge. Maybe they do like approximations and functions and blah blah blah. But I mean, well, our brain is also has a lot of neurons. Doesn't make it smart.
well said. All right. Well,
All right.
I'll let you get out of here, Shlomo. Thanks so much for talking to me. I'll talk to you in the
Thank you,
future.
John. Thank you, and thanks for having me. Bye bye. Thank you.